Hello and welcome to the Film Ireland podcast, where we are delighted to be partnering with Dublin International Film Festival, which runs from the 20th of February to the 2nd of March. And in this episode, we chat with Robert Byrne. Robert Byrne is the president of the board of the San Francisco Film Preserve and has spent his life in dedication to the restoration and preservation of films. He's a champion patron of DIFF and supports the development and delivery of their silent cinema strategy, which helps to build contemporary audiences for silent film in Ireland. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we're delighted. I think you've such an interesting background. But first, I think I'd love to ask you a little bit about why film and then why silent film? What is it about it that drew you to it and why do you love it so much?
Well, silent film, I don't know what it was that originally hooked me. It was, I grew up in a small town in Kentucky and we had nothing. We had no cinemas. We had no much of anything. And I discovered when I was 13 that our university had 5 silent films that you could check out on 8mm film, right? This was before VHS and before anything. But, we had our home movie projector and I watched those films over and over and over again. And, there were the classics, right? Potemkin and Gold Rush and Metropolis. And I just became fascinated by the era. It was just such a different look, a sort of different way of seeing the world and a different type of storytelling. And, you're a kid, you love science fiction. And then you look at Metropolis and go, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. So then I started just reading about these people, reading all the Chaplin's autobiography and Buster Keaton and reading about Fritz Lang, but you could, so frustrated you could never see the films. They weren't on television, they weren't anywhere until I discovered there was a company called Black Hawk Films where you could buy copies of films. So on Super 8, the full length films. So I would spend all summer mowing lawns to save up money to buy a movie that I'd read about. And that sort of, I don't know, it was always sort of it hooked me, and it hooked me in a big way. And then, in school, I'd have my own little film festivals. I'd set up on lunchtimes and show movies and stuff like that. And it just sort of was, I don't know, I can't necessarily explain it, but it was always just a hook for me, that period, the style of filmmaking, the sort of the creativity, filmmaking was it was a new technology. It was very plastic at the moment. So there was a way far more experimentation than people normally think about when they think about these films.
Different techniques, creativity and ingenuity, when you want to achieve something, and then it's like thinking outside the box instead of, you just go, this is VFX, this is this, where you're how things are shot in specific angles to create a 3D experience, even backdrops and stuff is very interesting.
Yeah, they were really, they were learning as they were going along. And sometimes you see some techniques that, we use today that started back then. You see things that they tried and that didn't work out. But it's a different art form than sound films. It is completely telling the story visually and conveying thought visually and conveying emotion visually, without dialogue to explain what you're thinking or to explain, some plot point or something. So you sort of get very interesting ways of conveying a character's point of view that are not just that person saying what their point of view is.
So tell me a little bit more about your journey then in being the president of the board in the San Francisco's Film Festival, your work in restoring these films. Talk to me a little bit about your journey over the years, from your love and then how, it became what you do essentially.
Right. So we have the San Francisco Silent Film Festival, which is in its 28th year now. Started with one film way back when. And it was really that issue we had of, well, there's no way, even in San Francisco, no really way to see these films as they were originally schemed. There's home video and that sort of thing, but our home base is the Castro Theater in San Francisco. It's a fantastic movie palace, seats 1,400 people, the enormous screen, built in 1922 during the silent era. And that is to see these films as they are originally shown, with live musicians on a gigantic screen, ideally, vintage 35 millimeter prints. And it became, we went from a one-day event to a multi-day event to grew up to 7 days to having multiple events during the year, and really grew a wide audience, because once people came and sort of got past their stereotype of what these films were like, it sort of opened a whole new world for them. So back in 2008, I took off for a couple of years and went to Amsterdam to take a master's program in film preservation and presentation. So came back, and in 2010, we started our own sort of film restoration and preservation initiative. So it was, we were showing these films, we were working with archives and that sort of thing, but it was like we needed to complete that loop. I mean, there's so much work to be done in terms of saving these films, making them presentable to audiences again, finding them in the nooks and crannies of the world. So we started slowly a film restoration project or initiative where every year we would work on a couple projects, restore the films, work with literally archives all around the world, do digital restorations. We'd make new 35 millimeter negatives for presentation, new 35 millimeter prints, present them at the festival. And then, of course, make them available. The point is access, not just make one restoration for one screening. And then the collection that has grown is stored at the Library of Congress. So again, we have these films that are then again preserved for generations to come. And then last year, we sort of spun off. That got, I think, so successful, we spun off into a new organization. So we split the organization between the film festival and what is now the San Francisco Film Preserve, which allows us put very specific focus on film preservation and restoration. And we've got we did our first premiere in New York at MoMA last month with a lost film, a Maurice Traynor film, gorgeous film called The White Heather from 1919. So we had the world premiere there, and now it's available for the world. And we have in the process 5 feature films that we're working on right now, plus a couple of interesting shorts.
I was reading up, and I know, like, with things like this, resources are so limited, and things, if they're not properly maintained, degrade. Do you ever feel like you're trying to go against time, or like that there's like a ticking time clock in the things that you can preserve, and what do you decide then are the kind of most important things to keep, and to it's more about like what's your decision process in total? Because do ethical issues come into play? Like, just say if it's like Nazi stuff, like you're like, okay, what's the reason people have to access this? Will it be used for positivity? Because I just presume it's a thing where all these are sort of slowly degrading if they're not kept. Then they're lost forever, which is like a tragedy.
It is true. It is a race against time, and there is more than anybody can do. I mean, more than 80% of all films made during the silent era, so that we'll call that from 1930 and earlier, are gone, right? There's only 20% left. And even that's a huge number of material, and there is very little commercial interest in doing this. So it falls to archives, it falls to state institutions, it falls to nonprofits to be able to do what we can. I mean, what we do is, it's a teaspoon in the ocean. So the projects we take on take different flavors. Sometimes they're passion projects of a film that we know of, or something that's been neglected that we really want to make sure that it's saved and that audiences now get to see it. Sometimes we go looking for films. Sometimes films come looking for us. we've been doing this long enough now, and we have the reputation that sometimes things get discovered and we get a phone call about, do we want to participate in that? Is in 2016, the original Sherlock Holmes film, the original Sherlock Holmes, that was the title, starring William Gillette, who was the first Sherlock Holmes, surfaced. It had been a lost film. No copy was known to survive. And it turned out we had a good relationship with the Cinémathèque Française. And they turned it up and contacted us if we wanted to collaborate on the restoration. And there we are. The film we just finished, The White Heather, Maurice Tourneur film, he was a great director, really beautiful work. And he's not necessarily one of the names a lot of people know today, but very few films of his survive. And it was 2 years ago in November that the print of this film, it was thought to be lost, turned up in Amsterdam. These things just surface. And again, it was the perfect way for us to partner with I Film Museum in Netherlands to bring it back to life.
And was there ever projects that got away, like, one that you're like, oh, we have this, and then when you sort of looked underneath the hood of the reel, that you're like, oh, this, like, it's gone, like.
Well, not so much, but what we do see, it does come home to us often that it's a race against time. And, I don't know if it's like you pick some metaphor, like a sinking ship or something. You can't save everybody. So which ones do you save? There's a Louise Brooks film, Now We're in the Air, that we restored a couple of years ago. And it was thought to be lost. And we found a copy in the Czech Knuckle Archive in Prague. And it was one single copy of nitrate print. And, it was a feature film, and there was about 25 minutes left. And the archive has the records. And this film had been in their archive, and they would inspect it periodically, like every 5 or 10 years, and record the length. And it's on an index card that was in the cans, right? And you would see over the years the film gets shorter and shorter and shorter. It was, the nitrate film was deteriorating, and they would chop off the bad part and throw it away. So, we got to it. If we'd done this project 20 years ago, we might have had the whole feature. Instead, we have a great 25 minutes that give you an idea of what the picture was like. But that was that. And this comes up quite often when we will, if when we're working on a restoration, if we can get to the nitrate print, the original print from the 20s or teens or whatever, that's going to be the highest resolution. That's going to be the best quality. That's what you want to work from. Well, often, archives will have made what they call a preservation copy, right? They'll make a negative off of that at some point in time to preserve. And so many times we get to working on a project, and then we have the preservation negative, and then we have the nitrate, and the nitrate will be so much shorter than the preservation. So we're so fortunate that they made those copies, but it's just this illustration of these things are just disappearing. And when they're gone, they're gone. There's nothing you can do about it.
And getting to share them with an audience. So this is something that I know the festival started originally with one screening, and then it grew and it grew. Sharing these pieces of work and these pieces of history, and this, like, I think it kind of taps into how drawn we are to different forms of storytelling, like as a species, and how important it is with audiences. What is that experience like? And that kind of like living element of bringing in music. Can you talk to me a little bit about what's your experience of that as the festival? Has that changed or grown over the past couple of years?
It's developed a lot. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One thing that I really enjoy from our restoration efforts is when we bring these films back, we're essentially having world premieres. Nobody alive has seen these films. So it's like you're bringing it back to the world, and it's really a special thing. Then than a film that maybe it's well known or something like that. But there is such an important aspect of seeing a couple things, seeing these films big. It's a visual medium. Films today are made so that you can watch them on a phone. In a silent film, films from this era, all your information is coming visually. And I don't know how many times I've seen a silent film on a TV or even on a beamer shown on a wall or something like that. And then you see it huge and you get I never noticed that before. Oh, this is that clue to the plot. Or, oh, this tells me about that. Or now I can read the sign in the background. Or you pick up cultural clues like, things you don't know about. Oh, somebody's wearing a black armband. That means somebody died, or all these sorts of cultural activities are. But seeing it huge, seeing it with an audience is such a different experience. I mean, it's always better to see a film with an audience, but silent film with a live musician. So it's a very much of a performance. It can be a very special and very unique experience. And it's almost a little hard to describe until you've been part of it. It's like the difference between listening to, Spotify and then going to a concert. There's this group emotion, there's this group togetherness of experience of the film, experiencing the music. And with silent film, you experience it as a group, but you experience it individually as well, because you sort of create your own soundtrack in your head of what you think these people's voices sound like, or the way you're experiencing the film. So each person actually interprets it a little differently as well. Your brain fills in visually, what you're not hearing.
I think it's so interesting is what would newcomers who say never watched a silent film, like what about the format might be surprising and about watching it in this space with an audience?
I think what is always surprising, with the festival, we always had the biggest challenge was getting somebody to come in the first time. People have a preconception or a stereotype of what a silent film is like. It's going to be herky-jerky. It's going to be Keystone Cops. It's going to be somebody up front banging on an upright piano. And what knocks them out is how sophisticated these films are and how creative they are and how good the music can be. And if we have a proper pairing of the music with the film, I always think curating these presentations is like matching food and wine. It is, if you get the right film and the right music at the same time, it really creates something that's greater than just the two parts. And I think people walk away going, for us, it was people leaving the theater all the time going, I have no idea. I didn't know that this is what that experience was going to be like. And they come back. And it's always the challenge of getting somebody in the front door, because it will typically sort of shatter their preconceptions of what that experience is going to be like.
And in terms of sort of capturing the human emotion of that time, it's serving as a piece of preservation of, you were saying that about rituals and storytelling and how things were slightly different, but slightly probably similar in ways that we don't think about. And even examining, say, the lens and how the lens perceives queerness and gender. Like, is there any elements of that might be kind of surprising again? So if you're like a fan of film, but you don't know where to start.
Oh, I think so. I think there's it is just as you say, it's sort of this interesting juxtaposition of the two. One is obviously the technology is very different, and the way that people use the technology of the time to solve whatever problem they have can be very different. At the same time, people haven't changed. So the emotions they're dealing with, the problems they're dealing with, the conflicts they're dealing with, that all those sort of things are really universal. And you can look back now, you're looking at a time machine 100 years ago and going, in a sense, people haven't changed. And you do get, can be more fluidity than you would expect, because we talk about pre-code, right? In the early 1930s, what sort of changed off. Well, in a certain sense, all of the silent era was pre-code. So you do get, often, it's not rare to find gender-coded situations, right? It won't come out flat out, but you'll see women dancing with other women dressed as men. You'll see sort of juxtaposition of roles and that sort of thing. The flip side of that is, particularly for American films, I mean, there's racism, and you just can't get past that. There's racial stereotyping. You get white actors in blackface. You get Asian stereotypes that are incredibly unfortunate. There's a ways we get around that. One is, we have it in San Francisco. We have a large Asian audience. We show Japanese silent films, and we show Chinese silent films. And so silent film was a worldwide phenomenon, and those films traveled so much more than they do today, because all you had to do was change the titles. You didn't have to dub, you didn't have to work with spoken dialogue and that sort of thing. So during the 20s, you were much more likely, as an average American audience, to see a French film or a German film or an Italian film than you would be today. Because those films, likewise, that's how American films got everywhere too, is because they could just change the titles. So that's a long way of answering your question, but there's more than you would expect to see in terms of very rigid role models for any given kind of person or situation.
I think that's fascinating, because before that big turn, it's so surprising to see the things that did make it in terms of sexuality and what was implied, and to see how it regresses. It's sort of scary now, because you're like, what's going to happen now?
Oh my God. Yes.
But it's to see also those cyclical moments, and where they are placed in history is interesting as well, and how different movements line up with different kind of creative movements, and how they line up with different politics at the time. And I was just wondering, if you're and again, if what you're doing is kind of taking little pieces from all over the world, does it serve as a snapshot, or in terms of the political leanings and of the history that we know is coming?
I think so. I mean, I think you do get, for instance, I'm in love with German Weimar films. So the late 20s and early 30s German films, those are some really dark films. And, these are dark times. And there's so much that I find that speaks today to those films, kind of speak to today to a certain extent.
And even in terms of different countries, so Japan, and even if you're kind of getting a snapshot, do you kind of take a kind of societal temperature of where people are? There's a darkness in that's leading up to World War II, or where there's certain elements of prosperity. But I was I don't think there was that much prosperity. Was there? Maybe.
Yeah. So I mean, you get these, the late 20s America, you get these crazy exuberance and the flappers and that. But the Depression was just around the corner. You get Weimar Germany. You get the Russian films are, of course, amazing. The Georgian film that we have programmed for the festival is going to knock people's socks off. It is, I guarantee, people that come to this film don't know what they're going to get themselves into. It is so funny, so creative. So I don't even know what you'd call it. I don't know if it's satire. I don't know if it's Dada. I don't know if it's avant-garde. I don't know if it's absurdist. It was banned in Russia for 50 years. This is an amazing satire on bureaucracy and red tape. And it was not anything Stalin necessarily needed anybody to watch.
I love this. Actually, and this is the perfect time to segue into the work that you do. You're a champion patron of Dublin International Film Festival, and you've been developing and delivering their silent cinema strategy. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that came about and how it's evolved over the years. And then we'll get into the lovely chatting about the lineup.
Sure, sure, sure. My wife and I have been living in Dublin since 2012. And I'd sort of gone back and forth between San Francisco. I still have my footprint there and with the festival, and we worked there. But the film work I do is kind of universal, so I can be anywhere and do that. So over the years, I've gotten myself more and more involved with the Irish Film Institute, and of course with Creagh and with the Dublin International Film Festival. And it was a couple of years before COVID that we really got into the conversation. Well, a couple things. One is that we had some pretty great films that we'd restored that I really thought, these are things that would be great for the audience of DIFF. So we started with every year having one or two of the films that we'd restored presented here in Dublin during the festival. And that sort of evolved into a dialogue of how do we build more of an audience for silent film, not just at DIFF, but in general. The IFI does some silent film programming, but there is so much that we can do. And I don't think of it necessarily just silent film, but it is like, this is the first 35 years of cinema. This is a big chunk of our audiovisual heritage. And these are films, a lot of these films that may have shown in Dublin cinemas at the time. Now, Dublin or Ireland itself didn't have much of a film industry during the time. There were no Irish production companies, but there were films that were shot in Ireland. Unfortunately, a lot of those are newsreels, and fortunately, those are shot. Those are British companies or French companies. So there's a point of view that is fairly unpalatable. But there was an American company called Kalem, Kalem, that for 6 years, came over took ship with the whole film crew and the cast and everything else. And they would spend a summer shooting films in Ireland. Primarily for the huge Irish audience back in America. So they'd see Irish stories shot in Ireland and that sort of thing. But a number of these films still survive, and they became known as the O'Kalems. There's about a dozen or 14 that survive. We're actually working on restoring one of them right now. But that was a roundabout answer too. But the point is bringing an awareness of silent film and of that era of filmmaking more into the sort of the mainstream of film consciousness here.
And in terms of presenting them with music for events, and you were talking about pairing the right live musicians, the right energy for those pieces, and how again it brings so much life and joy into it. Talk to me a little bit about how you get the musicians that have that skill set, how they are interpreting then this for like a modern audience.
Right. So the key is really for us from the music is the music has to support the film. You can take a lot of different directions at a film with music. And that's one of the beautiful things about this. I've seen some films a dozen times, but with a dozen different accompaniments. And some are wildly successful and some are not. But it really comes down to if that musician is in sync with the film. Now, frankly, we're most successful with musicians this is what they do for a living, right? They accompany silent film because it's a very different thing. You're not playing songs and you're not singing, there's not vocals. And you're playing, maybe 2 hours nonstop. You're going through, but you are completely in sync with the film. You're not drawing attention to yourself. The spotlight isn't on the musician, but that musician is there, and that sort of enhancement of what the music gives you as a, I wouldn't even say a supplement, because they really merge together. If it's perfect, the experience you're having is 50% music and 50% image. And the combination of those two things is really powerful. And even different musicians have different styles. I mean, I have one person that I love for a melodrama or for some heart-wrenching thing. This person, their skills are just so exquisite. And you can take the most banal melodrama and you'll be crying at the end of it. You will totally buy into that film just through the music. So at the festival this year, we have Serge Bromberg that's going to play for the three short films, the three short comedies, and he's perfect. Serge is a showman. These films hilarious. The music plus the film. If you were watching this film silent, you go, "Wow, that's pretty funny." But the music and having 300 people laughing at the same time is going to be really, really, really fun.
I'm just looking at he's a restorer as well, and an accompanist, and a producer, and a writer, and a director.
Yeah, Serge is definitely a jack of all trades. I think he started as a film collector. He's a he's a one of a kind personality for sure. I mean, he loves what he does, and it shows. And he's passionate about the films and about restoring them and bringing them back to an audience. And as you mentioned, he's a performer too. And he's not just playing the piano. Serge is a showman. It will be a lot of fun. It will be a lot of fun.
So there is going to be a discussion between you and him happening as part of the program.
Yeah, well, there's a separate program. So we have a panel that will be over at the complex on Sunday, the 23rd. So it'll be myself and Serge, and I think there'll be 3 or 4 other people that'll be joining the group to talk about film restoration and silent film in general and whatever comes up.
There's some titles. I know you had mentioned that like really, really interesting banned Russian film. So talk to me. I think there's even of your own, there's The Adventures of Prince Ahmed.
Yes. Ah, yes. That is a fascinating film. So it is made by the German filmmaker Lotte Reiniger, female filmmaker. And I can't call it animated and I can't call it stop motion. It is made with cutouts. I'm going to very poorly describe what is a fascinating film to watch. It's a fairy tale. But the stop motion animation using silhouettes and cutouts to do this film are just exquisite. I don't know. I've seen the film 24 times. Every time I see it, I'm just astonished by it. It's one of those films you do 2 things at the same time. You really appreciate the film itself. You just get into the story and watching it, and like it's very colorful. It's very artistic. And then at the same time, you're back in your mind's going like, how much work went into making this film? It's a sort of mind-boggling what it's feature length. How many months? How many months did it take to make this film? But it pays off, right? We're watching it 100 years later and are still marvel at it. So
that will be accompanied by Conor Linehan, and that's the 22nd of February.
Yeah.
And then there's is it the Chemi Babia?
Yeah, I think it's Chemi Babia. But I use the American title, the English title, just My Grandmother, which is a lot easier to say.
Yeah, that's much. So My Grandmother. And on the 1st of March, and that's at 2:30, and that's accompanied by Meg Morley.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
This sounds very interesting to me as well. There's the Silent Shorts Gala. So it's big business, Mighty Like a Moose, and 1 week, accompanied by Serge. And that's on the Sunday. So presumably, is that just before you guys have your talk? So there'll be he'll do that, and then there'll be like following that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So we'll have the films at 1:30, and then I guess we'll tromp over to the complex for the panel.
Amazing. And in terms of like even say curating shorts, in terms of what was being produced, was there say like a set standard? What, You know, like were there kind of like common themes? Were there like three act structures for everything, or was it sort of very sectioned out? Because I often wonder, like, I mean, this technology back then would have been so expensive and hard. Does that limit it, or does that make people more creative, or does that do everything?
Oh, actually, I mean, the technology wise was actually dirt simple. That was the amazing thing, right? It was a box camera that was hand cranked. So I always, I always sort of liken the silent era in the beginning to sort of like the internet era. So all of a sudden, there's new technology, and it was accessible, and people just took off and went with it and went in 100 different directions. But the silent comedies, the three that we have, are all quite different, and they're all take different approaches. So there's 1 week, which is Buster Keaton, and his creativity, his athleticism, his you won't believe what happens in this film. But Keaton tended to be a man against the world. You know, he'd always find himself in a situation, they had to deal with it. It was usually, I wouldn't say prop oriented, but like this film is about, he gets a wedding gift of a build it yourself house. And everything is about this house and him building it and then building it incorrectly, and then the mayhem that ensues. The big business is Laurel and Hardy, and Laurel and Hardy's style was kind of like, you start off easy and then things just really get out of hand until complete pandemonium at the end. So this is a theme you'll see in a lot of their films. It's like, it starts with a tit for tat, and next thing you know, it's nuclear war at the end. So big business is kind of that.
You can kind of see like the influence of like, you know, the farcical unraveling and then lead up to the set piece of the overt physical comedy where everything culminates. That is still very much part of modern day cinema.
Right.
Like that if it isn't broke, don't fix it. That those original versions of it.
Yeah. Well, the early ones always ended up in a chase, you know, and these are sort of beyond that. So if you go early Keystone and, you know, pre-20s, you tended to be a comedy, a situation, something happened, and then there was a chase that was very funny. And everything always, all comedies, all short comedies sort of ended up with a chase. And by the 20s, you've kind of gone beyond just people running down the street and mayhem ensuing. And then Charlie Chase, the third one, Mighty Like a Moose, is more of a domestic comedy. That was sort of his genre. So each of these three different films are going to be very different in terms of, they complement each other extremely well, but they have very different approaches to what's called a true real comedy. So it's about 20 minutes. Each one's about 20 minutes.
Brilliant. That sounds like that does sound really sort of fascinating as well. And like that you kind of get a like a flavor of voices. That's such an interesting presentation. In terms of curating them, okay, so you've been working with DIFF since 2018, and like you noted that the first three that you had programmed with them was the Behind the Door, the Italian Straw Hat, and then I think the following year was Fragment of an Empire, and you
Yes.
restored all those. If you like, if you're the restorer and the programmer, like, are they your babies then? Like, are they something that you've kind of like born and nurtured, and you want like to have them seen as much as possible?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for a lot of reasons. First of all, we wouldn't have spent all the time and energy and money in restoring them, but they're not films we really didn't believe in the first place, right? There's more that can be more to do than can be done. So we have to be passionate about a film before we get started on it. So all three of those films were definitely passion projects, and they were films, all three, nobody had ever seen. So we were getting these back into an audience to see them and to know them and to appreciate them. But also, you know, this is a big part of our mission, right? So it's three legs. It is restoration first. It's preservation, because there's no point in doing or restoring anything we're not going to preserve it. But it's access. I mean, the point of doing all of that is to get them back in front of an audience. is for people to see them. There's no point in restoring it. There's no point in preserving it if people aren't seeing them. So we definitely, through, our advocates, none of the films we're showing this year are restorations. I mean, I'm an advocate for these types of films in general, but there are certain ones that I really think people need to see this. They're going to be surprised.
So you funded the San Francisco Film Preserve, and we had sort of talked about that and the cinematic works. And it has been going well, and you've been doing work. Is there, in terms of a hunger and an energy for it, like I know things are sort of shifting politically. Do you feel like this is sort of going in a good direction now? Like right now, given the politics of things. Like I know like there's certain kind of like nonprofits and things, that might be non-funded, that the goodwill is still there to really like celebrate those creative artworks.
I think so. I think it's what we're working on is universal. And I think preservation speaks to people. I think the fact that what we're doing is, well, nothing's permanent, but it's permanent as something you get in the audiovisual world. And I think people do see value in the things that we're doing. And I think they are very willing to support that. All of our funding comes through private donations. So we are, in today's climate, we're fortunate that we don't rely on government grants, which is a good thing. So we're not worried about that funding coming out from under us. And I think the people that do support us see real value in what we're doing. And I think they do like supporting something that has a certain permanence to it.
Okay, so you have mentioned some very interesting Irish films. So it was you restored the gold collection of amateur film shot in Kerry's in the 1920s, and that premiered 2 years ago at DIFF. Just tell me a little bit about the perspectives of people in terms of what was happening at the time in Kerry.
Yeah, so this was a cache of film that surfaced, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago now. So they were not fiction films. So there was an American naturalist named Benjamin Galt who came and lived in Kerry and out on the Blasket Islands for more than a year and to study birds. He was collecting feathers and specimens and birds and that sort of thing. But remarkably, he also took with him a 35 millimeter motion picture camera, which would have been insanely rare, and took films. You think of them like home movies. Lots of birds, but also he turned his camera onto the people, onto the villages, onto the area that he was with, the people that he was with. And so these films are a genuine time capsule from more than 100 years ago of what Kerry and the Blaskets were like. And they are so amazing, so beautiful, so mesmerizing. You'll get there's summer shot in Cork, but you'll get on the islands, you'll get people going to a church, you'll get people, farmers, guys digging turf, all sorts of things like that you really see the people. And you talked earlier about like how people moved, what their hair was like, what they wore, that sorts of thing. It's in these films, and it's so gorgeous. And we premiered a couple of years ago at DIFF at IFI. They've screened at IFI auditorium. And then the following day, we went out to the Blasket Center in Dingle and showed the films there again. And we had beautiful musical accompaniment by the Granville sisters. And, you're in the audience, you're showing these films where they were shot. And people in the audience are seeing their ancestors, or they're seeing, I don't know if they really did, but, woman saying, I saw my mother, when she was a child. And, we went to the villages, right, that basically haven't changed. So it was such an emotional sort of giving back of those films. And they've really gotten around a lot, right? The IFI has them up on the IFI player now, and with the Granville Sisters music, and they're really, really worth a look. So when we talk about film, we're not necessarily always talking about fiction films, right? We work on several different things. So we've reconstructed early lost films from flip books. We have these amateur films here. So there's different directions you can come at when you come to historical motion pictures that aren't studio produced fiction films.
And it captures so much, and I think so much who we are. And just before we go, like, what's one of the most unusual or surprising things that has been captured in film, or that you've sort of come across that is just might shock people or might play up against expectations?
I think sometimes, again, we get shocked by. We think our era is more sophisticated, and we think that we know more than people in the past did. And I think what is surprising, I don't know if I call it shocking, but is often to recognize things in films that are early films that are very sophisticated, or that are portrayed in a way that you really don't expect. Behind the Door, one of my favorite films to share with people it's because there are some ridiculously shocking things in this film. There's a brutality, there's emotion, there's things that that you wouldn't expect that would be shocking in a film today, and that you have no conception that something filmed in 1919 could come across that way.
It's fascinating. So I think for people to get a taste of what's there, to make sure that there's such a brilliant program this year, to head on to diff.ie and get their tickets. And yeah, and if there's one thing that you'd be like, okay, there's one film everyone has to watch, like it's just the thing. You're like, okay, to give you a sense of how interesting and nuanced, if you'd be like your absolute favorite, what would it be?
I think I would go with Chemi Babia. I think my grandmother. I think I'm going to be very interested to hear what people have to say about that film after they see it. Whatever they're expecting, it is not going to be what they're expecting. So it's fun. It's bizarre. It's you will spend a lot of time in that film going, what? And laughing. So I think that would be the one that, I think the odd title might put people off, but I think that would be the one that might be unexpected surprise if it's worth the investment if you want to go to that one.
Oh, I love that. That sounds like a talking one afterwards.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Oh, it's really my pleasure.
Is presenting Silent Cinema Restoration and Celebration on Sunday the 23rd of February at the Complex. So for tickets and more, visit diff.ie.